Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Um, Today, I'm going to do another conversation on the Archives Unbound conference. This one, I think folks will appreciate because it's really trying to think with a couple of really share a couple of the presentations that I think have tactical implications for movements and things like that. So, anyway, I hope that this is useful for folks, and be sure to do the things and like the video, share it with folks, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Um, but the first one that we're gonna do, well, let me just say a couple things up front. So we're gonna cover a couple of themes today. The first one has to do with, kind of information security, movement work, a little bit of, you know, basically, yeah, I'm going to let it speak for itself. So let me say this. I'm going to play two clips from panels. So there'll be about 40 minutes of that. And then I'm going to share an interview that I conducted with Damien Sojoyner and Shana Redmond. And that's basically it. I'll add in some other commentary. I'll take questions if people have them. But I really wanted to highlight and share some of the work that people did. There's links in the show description to four different panels. So um, I'll introduce and play a couple of them. And then the other ones that I'm not going to play today, just due to time and also a couple of audio issues with them. Um, they're also linked, and I'll say more about that before I play the interview with Shauna and Damien. But it's all of them. I encourage people to check out all four of them because they were four of, I think, the best put together. And honestly, like, everything was really, really good. I mean, everybody really brought their A game, which is not always the case, but I guess, you would expect it considering how much Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson mean to the people who were doing these presentations, or how much they were influenced by their work. So let me say, so let me do a quick introduction. So the first one, actually, the first one I'm going to play is, because I have it queued up already, is Moon-Ho Jung. So he's a professor of history and labor studies at the University of Washington. He is the author of the book Menace to Empire, Anti-Colonial Solidarities and Trans-Pacific Origins of the U.S. Security State, which actually was a book, to be fair, like, Dan Berger recommended this book to me a couple of years ago and said, you have to have this person on. And, Josh and I did not get around to it yet. And, it's one of those things, you meet somebody and you're like, oh, yeah, like that, we absolutely should have. And hopefully we will. So I did speak to him at the conference, and hopefully we can work to have him on to talk about that book, because that book and its work is really interesting. And he says a little bit about it in this presentation. So you all, I think, will get a sense of why it overlaps and connects to the work that we've been trying to do with Millennials Are Killing Capitalism for the last 7 years now. So I'm just going to play that to get us started, and then we'll go into more. Feel free, you know, use the chat. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in. All of the links that I provided should work with timestamps, so people should be able to see those links, go to those links, and go directly to the specific presentation that we're referencing in this conversation. And again, just before I started, I do want to really underscore my gratitude to the organizers of the conference, many of whom are now on strike. Solidarity to them, solidarity to all of the UAW workers in the UC system that are on strike now. I think there's like at least 5 campuses, something like that, that are on strike, and it's going to continue to grow, I think, unless the UC system, comes to the table and negotiates. And it's a strike that's, whether they how vocally they want to say this as a whole union, it's very much directly tied to Palestine, to the defense of student workers, grad workers, and their ability to protest against the war, against U.S. US complicity in the war against the way that the UC system provides military research and, um, money aid, right, or receives aid, has these relationships with organizations like the Department of Defense. What a stupid name for that place. And military contractors and all of that, right? So it's directly connected to that. So anyway, solidarity to all of them. All right, let's get into Moon-Ho Jung's presentation.
Program. All right. It is my deep honor to be here with you today. Thank you to all the organizers. Um, Let me begin on a sad note. Um, Less than 2 weeks ago, very unexpectedly, I received word that my longtime mentor, Gary Okihiro, was not doing well and that he had been admitted into intensive care. Within 24 hours of receiving that shocking news, Gary was gone. And I'm still trying to process his sudden passing. Um, so let me begin my comments today by quoting from one of Gary Okihiro's last books, titled Third World Studies, Theorizing Liberation, which came out in 2016. In that work, Okihiro reminds us of the revolutionary ambitions of the Third World movement, including the demand for Third World studies in US universities, a demand that he argues would be co opted and domesticated as ethnic studies. In 1968, at San Francisco State, student activists under the banner of the Third World Liberation Front declared, uh, we adhere to the struggles in Asia, Africa, and Latin America ideologically, spiritually, and culturally. We have decided to fuse ourselves with the masses of third world people, which are a majority of the world's peoples, to create, through struggles, a new humanity, a new humanism, a new world consciousness, and collectively control our own destinies. Third world internationalism, Black internationalism, wrestled with and rested on a historical consciousness on a grand scale. Over 400 years of the modern world that have been shaped and defined by colonialism and racial capitalism, as Cedric Robinson's scholarship made so clear to us. The genealogy of a revolutionary third world studies, as Okihiro saw it, could be traced back to W.E.B. Du Bois in the opening decades of the 20th century, long before the term third world came into being. But the global struggle against colonialism and racism was surely beginning to take root in ways that preceded and exceeded the global hegemony of nation states and the dogmatic entrenchment of communism and anti-communism around the world. So it's that moment of new anti-colonial possibilities that I would like to give a slight glimpse of today, of what Lisa Lowe has called a past conditional temporality. In our pursuit of the past beyond nationalism, beyond liberalism, we can look for, in those words, other conditions of possibility that were vanquished by liberal political reason and its promises of freedom, and to open those conditions to pursue what might have been. So let me begin with this story, the story of Jothar Nishida and what he could have been and what he could have represented. All right, the US government really wanted to pin Jothar Nishida down, racially, politically, geographically, but he proved very elusive. Reportedly hailing from Hawaii and described as a Japanese Turkish half breed in government reports. Okay. He came to the attention of California and federal officials during World War I. In 1919, he was arrested for violating California's recently passed law on criminal syndicalism for operating the Red International Bookshop in Los Angeles. Not satisfied with Nishida's guilty plea and 5 years probation, the Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner to the FBI, handed him over to immigration authorities to deport him as an alien anarchist. But his evasive responses foiled the plan. Nishida claimed to be at different moments a Hindu, Turkish, and Japanese. But British, Ottoman, and Japanese officials all refused to recognize him as one of their own. So there was nowhere to deport him to. Now, Nishida next appeared in Bureau reports a year later in 1921 when an agent in Miami, Florida, reported that a charismatic black speaker was delivering radical speeches at gatherings sponsored by Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. The speaker was Jothar Nishida. All right. Perhaps sensing that Bureau officials were after him, Nishida quickly checked out of the colored hotel that he had been staying at and told the owner that he was leaving for the Bahamas. A bit later, a co-worker at the cabaret where Nishida worked told the Bureau agent that Nishida was, quote, an advocate of armed revolution in order to overthrow the government, not only from the viewpoint of the Negro, but from the viewpoint of a cosmopolitan who viewed any kind of racial prejudice as wrong, regardless of the race or color. Now, the head of the Bureau, in response, instructed his agents to look for connections between Nishida and the Japanese government. Okay, he was convinced that Nishida was a Japanese government operative assigned to foment trouble among African Americans. Now, in the meantime, Bureau agents in Florida heard that Nishida got on a ship bound for Galveston, Texas. Okay, assuming that Nishida had been born in Honolulu to a Japanese father and a Turkish mother, another Bureau agent was dispatched to greet that vessel in Galveston. But that agent reported that he could not find, quote, any person having Japanese appearance or characteristics. It really sucks when racial profiling does not work. Now, after interviewing the ship's crew, the agent wrote down a more exacting physical description of Nishida. Okay, about 5'10", 180 pounds, very black, kinky hair, small black mustache. Now, in a separate report, the Bureau agent in Los Angeles became convinced that Nishida was not Japanese at all. Okay, the agent wrote, the truth is that he is an American or Jamaican Negro, trying to pose as a member of another race and thus obtain social privileges not granted to Negroes. Now, whatever his racial background, Nishida remained on the move. Okay, he was a fugitive. For weeks, U.S. federal agents along the U.S.-Mexico border tried to locate his whereabouts, having heard that he was on his way to Mexico City. Bureau agents suggested that Nishida had plans to work with revolutionaries in Mexico and to affiliate with the Third International, marking him as, quote, a dangerous radical force. So why did agents of the emergent and expanding U.S. security apparatus want to find Nishida so badly? Because Nishida was defiantly Japanese, black, and red. In their eyes, a racial and political mixture of the most dangerous type. He was third world internationalism, black internationalism personified. Now, I don't know if Nishida made it to Mexico City, but it was no surprise that agents of the US government saw in Nishida's movements potential connections to Japan, Mexico, and international communism. In the 1920s, international communism generated critiques, organizations, and movements that increasingly drew links between struggles against white supremacy in the United States and anti-colonial struggles in Asia. A new world, what would become the third world, was emerging. Now, in the wake of World War I, race and empire took center stage in global politics. In 1917, V.I. Lenin published Imperialism, in which he theorized, as most of you know, that imperialism marked the monopoly stage of capitalism. As he led the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin challenged that world order, speaking boldly of self determination and the liberation of all colonies, the liberation of all dependent, oppressed, and non sovereign peoples, as he wrote. Now, not to be outdone, President Woodrow Wilson, that bastard, framed U.S. entry into World War I in 1917 as a cause for democracies, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, as he put it. Now, his statements definitely paled in comparison to Lenin's forthright language, but Wilson moved to embrace self-determination as as he put it, an imperative principle of action, championing the ideal to thwart, not to advance, revolutionary movements. Now, although Wilson proved quite adept at co-opting anti-colonialism, Wilson's position on race was another matter. When Japan's delegation demanded in 1919 a clause on racial non-discrimination in forming the League of Nations, Wilson, as head of post-war negotiations in Paris, maneuvered to kill that measure. The Japanese government's attempt to challenge white supremacy in Paris struck a chord among those dealing with the grinding effects of white supremacy in the United States. As in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War earlier, Black radicals became infatuated with Japan's promise, especially in the context of bloody race riots in the United States in the summer of 1919. Upon hearing rumors of an impending war between the United States and Japan, perhaps in alliance with Mexico, Cyril Briggs of the African Blood Brotherhood made it clear on which side he would fight. He stated, quote, "The Negro who fights against either Japan or Mexico is fighting for the white man against himself and for the perpetuation of white domination of the colored races, in opposition to the principle advocated by Japan of race equality. And that no loyal Negro will do." Now, as those feelings against white supremacy and empire percolated and circulated in the wake of World War I, the international communist movement helped to bring different movements and sentiments together, tying struggles against racism in the United States and against colonialism in Asia, theoretically and politically. So in 1919, Lenin reorganized the Communist International, usually called the Third International. In 1920, at the Second Congress, the Third International issued the Theses on the National and Colonial Question to confront the colonial order of things. Now, Lenin set the tone at the opening session of that Congress when he said, quote, "There are 1.25 billion people who find it impossible to live in the conditions of servitude that advanced and civilized capitalism wishes to impose on them." The Third International set out to organize that 70% of the world's population. In very straightforward language, the theses rejected the League of Nations and the entire notion of national equality and attempted to expose all of those bourgeois democratic lies, as they put it. By disaggregating nations, nationalisms, and internationalisms, the Third International placed racialized subjects of empire potentially, okay, potentially at the forefront of a worldwide communist movement. But the Third International was not yet ready. Using teleological Marxist formulations of capitalist development and proletarian revolution, the Third International ultimately relegated race to false consciousness. Race was an expression of petty bourgeois national prejudices that could and should be overcome by transforming, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat from a national dictatorship into an international dictatorship. At the Fourth Congress of the Third International in 1922, Claude McKay and other Black communists demanded a forceful reckoning with race, with the support and encouragement of Sen Katayama, who was in charge of the Third International's Eastern Commission, which was in charge of the Negro Department. McKay called out the U.S. delegation for dismissing race and for practicing white supremacy. The theses on the Negro question placed African Americans at the forefront of the liberation struggle of the entire African race and argued that, quote, the enemy of the black race and the enemy of the white workers are one and the same: capitalism and imperialism. Meanwhile, at the same Congress, the theses on the Eastern question elaborated on the dynamics of race, nation, and revolution across the Pacific. Key political struggles in the colonial East had to focus on empire. The Third International argued to rally the masses toward revolutionary nationalism, a step toward an eventual international revolution. And it was that juxtaposition of what was happening in the colonial East and in the US South that eventually would lead to the Black Belt thesis, with the Third International imploring, quote, communists to apply the theses on the colonial question to the Negro problem. Now, I don't mean to suggest that these intellectual and political debates happening in Moscow somehow produced local struggles against racism and colonialism, but I would like to suggest that they did spur new imaginaries and mobilize revolutionaries around the world. Racialized subjects of empire could envision new frames of analysis and moved and mobilized accordingly. Just to give one example, in Paris, the man who would later rename himself Ho Chi Minh had a visceral response to the theses on the national and colonial question. He said he didn't really get Marx, okay? He admitted that. But he got Lenin, okay? He got Lenin because Lenin addressed colonialism. He exclaimed, "What emotion, enthusiasm, clear-sightedness, and confidence it instilled in me." Upon learning of Lenin's death in January of 1924, Ho Chi Minh reflected on the Bolshevik leader's significance to colonize subjects around the world. He wrote, "It is true that black or yellow people do not yet know clearly who Lenin is or where Russia is. But all of them have secretly learned that in a faraway corner of the earth, there is a nation that has succeeded in overthrowing its exploiters and is managing in its own country with no need for masters and governors general." They also heard that Lenin, quote, called upon the white people to help the yellow and black peoples to free themselves from the foreign aggressor's yoke. As Ho Chi Minh wrote that obituary of Lenin, he also published articles on the brutality of lynching and the Ku Klux Klan in the United States and inter-imperial state violence in the Pacific. Race and the US empire were on his mind long before the Vietnam War. Those global contexts would frame Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary dreams for a free Vietnam over the next half century. So if empires awakened and moved revolutionaries to international communism, the US state, along with the British state, the Japanese state, followed their movements, seeing and magnifying interracial solidarities against white supremacy and empire that were at once very real and imagined. They saw a third world internationalism on the rise. In many ways, agents of the US security state have been looking for what Jothar Nishida represented for more than 100 years. That search will never end, in part because that world of revolutionary movements against white supremacy and empire, a third world consciousness, was born before nation states, before international relations became normalized and universalized. And that is a source of hope. And with Cedric Robinson and Gary Okihiro as our historical guides, I know that what might have been could still be. Thank you.
All right, so that's the first one. Couple of things quickly, just to say, yeah, great discussion. Really made me interested in reading that book, Menace to Empire. Just to note also, like I'm also thinking with Frances Hasso here in the recent conversation we had with her, right? But, there's a way that we often think about Japan in a very specific way, empire, which it was, right? Fascists, which it was. Um, but and that can make it seem really illogical to people why somebody like W.E. Du Bois would support them, during World War II. But there is this other history too. I mean, also Francis talks about Japan as being the promoter of um, the anti-racist language and terminology within the League of Nations and so on, which of course they didn't end up adopting. But there's more to delve into there. Obviously, the figure of Lothar Noshida, which the fascinating story. And I should say about that panel, and I put it in the chat, but it was a panel specifically about third world internationalism, and I think this again is something that people sometimes don't pick up on as much within Cedric Robinson's work, particularly if they just read Black Marxism, because even though it's certainly an internationalist text, or at least a text that focuses on different areas throughout the Atlantic, the three figures he chooses are United States figures, right? Or people living in the United States. And so, you can, if you just read that book, you could come away thinking that his project was really primarily thinking about the Black Atlantic and the United States. And, I think that one of the things that those panelists remind us, Stephen Osuna was the one I showed on Wednesday, talking about Cedric Robinson's internationalism. Tiffany Willoughby Herrard gave a great presentation, as did Serene Cycli. Those were the other panelists, um, talking about, internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and so on. And yeah, I mean, Cedric and Elizabeth hosted a show for, I think they said 43 years on that could be wrong, but I think it was that long, on called the Third World News Review, right? And this was about getting news from around the world, working with media workers on the ground from around the world. Um, but also, as I think Stephen Osuna said in his presentation, but other people did as well, when they used the term third world, it wasn't just to be news of, uh, you know, this other place somewhere else. Like, they saw the third world within Los Angeles, right? They saw the third world within Paris. They saw the third world within London, right? And so on. So it was also a analytic that allowed them to think um, about the third world as not just a place outside, right? But as something that is constantly produced within the so-called first world, right? And this is a basis for linking up and, um, you know, as many could argue, right, that this is like the working class of the world, right? That black and brown workers and other workers who are, you know, have are put through these processes of racialization and exploitation, right? Make up certainly the overwhelming majority of the people doing, the the most intensive forms of labor. And so anyway, really interesting stuff. So the second one I'm gonna play is with Sophie Toupin, and I hope I pronounced that right. She's a scholar in Canada. Let me say a couple words about her from her bio. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Information and Communication at Laval University in Quebec. Um, she mobilizes critical approaches such as feminist, anti-colonial, and decolonial to apprehend, analyze, and rethink the digital and technological. She has been active in several collectives and organizations supporting the global movement of community radio, activist media and technologies, immigrant workers, and people without status. And I will just say also, this is somebody that Elizabeth Robinson specifically said to me. She's like, you have to meet Sophie, you have to talk to her, like you have to connect. And so I really want to get her on the show, and you'll see why, I think, as you watch this panel. Um, so yeah, I'm not going to say too much more other than it's about, South African apartheid and the subversive work that people did to undermine it, right? All right, so
Good morning.
that is actually Shana Redmond's panel. So hang on one second. That's also an excellent panel. The reason I'm not going to play all of that, and I'm going to play an interview with Shauna and Damien at the close of this, is because they used music in it, and I don't want to risk a copyright hit taking this live stream down. They can obviously use it in an educational setting on an unmonetized video, but there's a chance that if I did use it, that could take down the live stream for copyright, and so that's part of it. Also, the because of the way they use the audio, like I mentioned, how the clapping and the laughing is not picked up in these presentations. Some of the music cuts out, and so unfortunately, you don't get the full experience of what it was like to be there. But I still really encourage people to watch those presentations from Shauna and Damien, which are in the show notes, because you will catch some of it and you can go look up the songs and listen to them yourselves, but you'll also see how they incorporate music into their pedagogy, right? Which is the thing I'm kind of going to talk to them about. Um, all right. At the start of this video, I should say that there's like a weird, it'll look like it says unsupported signal. So I should say it clears up in a second and the video comes live in a second, but I start that way because you need the audio from that part too. So.
Thank you for the work that you're all doing. So my presentation is called Anticolonial Media and Communication and Technology. And it's the mosquito on the elephant behind, as Elizabeth has said in a great article that she wrote for in 2005. So I'm visiting from the land of the Kenyekehanga and the Haudenosaunee, Montreal. So this morning, I want to briefly discuss how I came to understand the importance of people-powered media, communication, and technology, specifically within historical liberation movements to counter imperialism and settler colonialism. But my comments also apply to contemporary movements. And so in this presentation, I focus on the practice and the making of anti-colonial media and communication. So as the pictures on this slide show, the encampments, so there are two in Montreal, have made their own people-powered media, which include CKUT 90.3 FM campus and community radio station that broadcasts live from the McGill and Concordia encampment. There's newsletters, there's zines, there's a signal group of professors who are coordinating to support the students in providing food, coffee, making rounds of laundry, driving trucks with loads of wood pellets, as April and May are rainy months in Montreal, writing affidavits when university administrations decide to launch injunction against encampment, and people-powered low-tech anti-surveillance mechanism like putting a plastic bag around a university camera, providing masks or keffiyehs or umbrellas to counter doxing. So now let me go back a little bit in time when I first met Elizabeth in the mid-2000s when she was working at KCSB, and she was on the International Board of Directors of the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, AMARC, an organization that was started in 1983 in Montreal that was promoting the movement of community radio worldwide. Here. So at the time, I was a young administrative assistant working for AMARC. And Elizabeth took me under her wing, trained me not only in how to do community radio, but also in social and political thoughts, on how to build movements. And she introduced me to extraordinary intellectuals from South Africa, Kenya, Mexico, India, Ghana, and so many other places. And as a young person, Elizabeth had a profound impact on my general political consciousness, on how to orient my moral and social justice compass, my understanding of the importance of fighting for community media, communication and technology, and how clandestine radio was used during liberation struggles in Latin America, in Africa especially. Elizabeth had an impact on me, as I have described, but also on thousands and thousands of students, workers, activists, and radio practitioners over the years and from all over the world. Yes, yes. So when we traveled together to AMAR conferences and gathering, she shared many stories about her own radio show, No Alibi, about the Third World News Review. In addition to the movement she had been involved in, so that I could learn from past struggles. And the South African liberation struggle, so the anti-apartheid struggle, had quite an impact on me. And so in addition to being a community radio practitioner and supporting, together with Elizabeth and so many other people, the movement of community radio worldwide, I ventured in the world of tech activism. And so I had been influenced by the indie media movement, where techies and media activists worked hand in hand. The tech activists created the autonomous infrastructure needed for the content created by the media activists to circulate. At hacker conferences, I began learning about the history of hacking and tech activism, mostly in the Western world, in the US and Canada, in the Netherlands, and Germany and elsewhere. And I started wondering if and the extent to which liberation movements had developed their own communication infrastructure and technologies as part of their liberation struggles, and if back then there was such a thing as tech activism. And this is how I started researching and recovering a micro history of the development and the use of a fugitive tri-continental communication infrastructure that supported the South African national liberation struggle. So part of my work has focused on an entity called the Technical Committee, which was initially formed by members of the banned South African Communist Party in the early 1950s. The Technical Committee set up an underground radio in South Africa in the early 60s. And when forced into exile, they developed all sorts of communication technologies in the 70s to defy censorship, surveillance, and the jamming of the airwaves, including leaflet bombs, which were harmless leaflet launchers that just propelled in the air leaflets. And portable audio broadcasting tools that were left in crowded areas during rush hour, where you could hear for a few minutes the voice of Olivier Tambo, the president of the ANC. One of the most sophisticated technologies that they developed was an encrypted communication system that was coded by and operated by a number of South Africans, Dutch and Canadian anti-apartheid activists who were active in the 1980s and early 90s. The encrypted communication system allowed freedom fighters on the ground in South Africa to communicate secretly and transnationally with the senior leadership of the African National Congress based in Lusaka, Zambia, via London, Great Britain. And while the initial communication nexus was between Durban, London, and Lusaka, the encrypted communication system would later be operated from major cities in South Africa, Cape Town, Durban, Pretoria, and Johannesburg, as well as from Amsterdam, York in Great Britain, Tall Cree, an indigenous reserve in the northern part of Alberta, Canada, and Harare in Zimbabwe. It was also tested in Paris, but never operationalized. So this tricontinental encrypted communication system was operational between 1988 and 1992. And it was remarkable because it existed at a time when the internet, as we know it today, did not yet exist. The members of the technical committee believed that devices and machines could be used tactically for the benefit of resistance and in opposition to the type of science and technology conducted by the Republic of South Africa, which pursued a philosophy of scientific racism and eugenics, and which was supported politically and financially by Western nations, including the United States, Canada, the UK, and so many others. The coding and the development of this fugitive infrastructure was done by exiled South Africans, many of which were in Great Britain. They experimented with this emerging technology, which were the laptop computers that were becoming affordable. Computer encryption that was started to be developed. European countries had also invested massively in what was then called telematics, so telephone and informatique, so computers in French. And so, but the system they developed in Britain with all of these technologies needed to be tested and adapted on to the realities on the ground in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And so for that, they needed the solidarity of activists ready to dedicate part of their lives to the anti-apartheid struggle. For instance, to host the computer equipment and clandestine freedom fighters in South Africa, Canadians were recruited to set up safe houses in Joburg, Pretoria, Durban, and Cape Town, and to infiltrate the encrypted communication disk to cipher and decipher messages. They recruited the woman that we see over here, a KLM flight attendant named Antoinette, who was regularly doing the Amsterdam, Nairobi, Joburg route. And before South African freedom fighters were sent to South Africa to operate this fugitive tricontinental communication system, they were trained by Dutch activists to develop new personas. Actors, wig and makeup artists helped with disguises. Dentists made false teeth to change the facial appearance of operatives. And photographers prepared the false passport photos to get them into South Africa. And to operate this system, Dutch women were recruited to set in an office in Lusaka, Zambia, to receive and send a constant flow of communication messages. And exiled South African freedom fighters, particularly women, were sent to South Africa to become communication officers. So a whole infrastructure of international solidarity was required for this fugitive tricontinental communication infrastructure to exist, to be maintained, and to be cared for. Using the term fugitive communication infrastructure harks back to the Black radical tradition. And so one of the developers of the system I interviewed in Cape Town said, victory over Leviathan requires another approach. Create, don't fight. Create something new without announcing it, and quietly get on with developing an alternative that is out of sight and that they cannot imagine. So what circulated on this fugitive communication infrastructure? So the encrypted system allowed for highly strategic communication between freedom fighters on the ground and the leadership in exile to help organize the struggle, the sharing of logistical messages, the sharing of news between family members, who were separated because of the struggle. There is one message here that gives news about the kids of one freedom fighter in South Africa. And more mundane communication, asking for holidays, and the sharing of cultural production for freedom fighters in South Africa. They ask specifically for watching the 1985 documentary film by Lionel Nkagane titled Nelson Mandela, The Struggle is My Life. And Nkagane, we see here, was living in exile in Britain and was one of the originators of the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, FEPAKI, a group that wrote the 1975 in 1975, the Alger Charter of African Cinema. And they also asked for the film A World Apart about the life of Ruth First and Joe Slovo. The encrypted communication system was also able to circulate ANC and SAP's newsletters that were banned. No need to bring big suitcases full of newsletters by foot or air courier anymore. They could use the system to send the newsletters in zeros and ones, in bits and bytes. Because of censorship, many South Africans were hungry for critical perspective, and these newsletters were one way to provide such media. And now the need to go back into the archive. So what is needed is to excavate in the archive more of these stories of both overt but also covert or fugitive communication infrastructures that were developed during past liberation struggles. And covert infrastructures in particular comes to light and available for analysis only after the fact. For the act of revealing it during a struggle for emancipation could endanger those who are involved in making and operating them. And the telling of history through archive can be used as a liberation tool in the classroom, but also outside of it to inspire movement and struggle. And so this type of research and involvement in people-powered media, communication, and technology continues the work that Elizabeth and Cedric have been doing all of their lives. And while corporate communication infrastructure, such as Instagram and TikTok, can be very useful and can be used tactically, we need to remember that they're not working for us. They are corporations. We need to build, sustain, and care for alternative media and communication infrastructure collectively to be able to reimagine the world that we want to live in. Thank you.
All right. So I love that presentation. And I just want to say, too, that as somebody who, spends way too much time on these surveilled technologies like the one that I'm speaking to you from right now, um, that, yeah, absolutely, as Yipper99 says here, the internet is not your friend, and it is not the friend of radical social movements, especially not when we use the kind of dominant tools. But even like I don't think she would mind me saying this, but I had this little conversation with Sophia, and she was talking about like she was at a she was talking to activists, right? And they at an encampment or something like that were sharing their signal group through like a QR code, right? And we were just talking about how I mean Signal, right? Like we can have our critiques there. We could have a whole episode on Signal. Obviously, it's developed by or with military funding. You know, a lot of tech people still say it's secure. I don't know, but the point being that it's certainly not secure if you just give everybody at an encampment an open invitation to it, because you don't know these people, right? You don't know everybody in the space. You don't know, you can't possibly, right? And so um I don't say that uh, if sharing that was too much, I apologize, and I don't say that to in any way chastise, young organizers that are just figuring these things out. Um But I do think that when you listen to stories like the ones that Sophie shares there, like, there are so many rich lessons from past liberation struggles, and, you know, high tech may not always be our friends. In fact, I don't think it is, right? I think it's the higher tech that we are, the more the more likely we are to be surveilled, right? And I think unfortunately we're gonna see that too as these like is it Title 6 cases that are going up against like professors, and that'll be a very interesting thing to watch, right? Because obviously like there's the whole charges of anti-Semitism that this is based on, but like, how do you weigh that with anti-Palestinian racism, right? Or racism against people of color for participating in protests and organizing and free speech, so like those will be hairy legal struggles that will play out in different ways, I'm sure. But that's not the point. The point is that, having 80 people in your signal group is probably not the best way to do movement communications, particularly around coordinating actions. And we could see that we could look at that from a different lens, right? The WhatsApp chat group that was full of billionaires and communications folks that got outed into the Washington Post, right? Like, these are just not these are not the ways that we need to be thinking and moving around technology if we want to actually be able to try to engage in really important struggles, which are going to involve likely transgressing the boundaries of the law, right? And helping to defend or keep our comrades safe from, state repression and things like that, right? And I just think that there's better tools out there. There's better ways of operating, and that we need to learn. I appreciate Sophie saying like go into the archives, right, and really study these movements in terms of the ways that they created what she calls fugitive infrastructure, right? And so, anyways, I just really appreciated that conversation. So, the last thing I'm gonna play, and then I do have to get out of here in a few minutes. So this is an interview with Shana Redmond and Damien Sojoyner, and I put them in conversation together. It's not a great video. I took it on my phone and I didn't shoot it in the right angle, and Damien's face is kind of in and out of it, and my voice wasn't picked up, which is why I write the questions out on the slide, but then you can't really read them, so I'll read them aloud. Um, Again, like they brought me out there to do media stuff at this conference, and I'm ill-equipped technically to do that. So I learned a lot, and hopefully I'll be able to do it better if I get invited to anything else again, which may or may not be the case after this. But anyway, I put them in conversation because both of their panels featured music, which I don't know if they were the only ones. They probably weren't the only ones, but they might have been. But they certainly featured it more prominently within their presentations than anyone else. And they connected the music to the stories that they were telling, or the music was connected to the stories that they were telling. And again, it's like just it also speaks to Cedric and Elizabeth. Like they had tons and tons of music in their house, and CDs and movies and DVDs. And these are people who obviously Cedric Robinson wrote a book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, that's about the film industry, right? So like they're people who were deeply engaged in media. And I have another clip that I will play that speaks to that on another live probably. But so when we think with that, think with think with music and liberation in the Black radical tradition, but also pedagogically, right? Because I think this is really important. Is a lot of times we have this tendency to do a lot of on the left, right? To do a lot of political economy to explain why people live in the kinds of conditions that they do, to explain what would need to happen to change those conditions, the transformations that would be required, right? But we don't always do a great job of like just pulling in people, right? And connecting with people where they're at, right? And so anyways, hopefully this conversation gives a little bit towards that, and let me pull it up. All right, so I'm gonna read this because it is small, I'm sure, on your screens. But the question, which didn't get picked up because my audio didn't get picked up, it was really windy and there were these weird bells in the background. Question is, you both use music in your presentation, blues and gospel in Shana Redmond's, and hip hop in Damien Sojoyner's. Um, the specific songs, yeah, you can check out their presentations. They're in the show description. I know that. Um, in Shauna's, the song is "No Weapon," and then also a song by BB King, in Damien Sojoyner's, and I misspelled Damien's name in that thing. It's, um, I gotta fix that. It's Damien. Um, Damien did, Nipsey Hussle and a group called Haiku d'Etat, which I'm probably the only person on this live who knows who Haiku d'Etat was, but, shout out to them and Freestyle Fellowship. So how did work of people like Cedric Robinson and Clyde Woods influence your incorporation of music, of the musical, cultural, and spiritual elements into your work alongside things like political economy? That's the question. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, Cedric's influence on my work has been really tremendous in thinking about the ways in which we show up in the world as our complete selves. And I think his insistence on paying attention to kind of the full gamut of resistance, as kind of collapsed as that term sometimes is, really gave me space to actually put language to why I care so much about music and why we care so much about music, right? Because it's not just about parties, it's not just about joy, even. It's actually about sustainability, it's about community building, it's about survival. So, Diane Fugino asked a question on our panel on Friday that I've been thinking about, this kind of dichotomization between political economy and culture, right? And I think Cedric brought those two things together beautifully and insisted that we do that. And it became distilled for me in a way such that if you want to know how Black people live, you study political economy. If you want to know why Black people live, you study culture. And I think those things have to go together. The why has been urgently important to me in the face of so much state violence, so much, um, repression. But both of those things go together and urgently, necessarily. And I think Cedric gave so many of us permission and kind of the methods by which we do that successfully and articulately and rigorously, knowing that it's a forever project. There's never a period on this project, but that space really made sense to me as someone who, in my early formation, my formal education, I was trained by labor historians and cultural studies folks from the Birmingham School. Like, those were the two things that most influenced my development. So they had to speak, and they had to speak in one voice. And Cedric, when I came to his work, after already having been a student of Robin Kelly's, like, all of it started to crystallize and make a lot more sense for me.
Yeah, I just like, I follow up with that in terms of the aspects of Black radicalism Cedric centers within Black communities and Black working class communities in particular. And I don't think you can talk about Black culture, Black people, Black politics even without digging into music as being central to that formation itself. And the ways that Black people express themselves through a sense of politics or through a sense of sociality, it's oftentimes hard to put pen to paper, to name it. You have to listen to it in a very like vigorous type of way, or you have to be in a particular moment, particular space to actually get that feeling. And so, while you could play music at a conference, whatever, right? It's something else when that's played in a group setting where people all resonate with it, right? So you just try to take a little piece of that and hopefully people will understand it, right? But one of the things that he talks about in Black Marxism is the metaphysical aspect, of course, of Blackness and how Black people are bound together through that, right? And I think music is one of those things that does that bounding for Black people.
All right, so I'll just pause and read this question. So the question is, as far as pedagogy, Damien, again, I misspelled Damien, Damien. I know you come from an educational background. Shauna, share some of your training and background as a scholar. I was less familiar with Shauna's work, although that shouldn't be the case. And I'm looking in. She wrote a book on Paul Robeson, also a book called Anthem. I'm interested in engaging that more, and hopefully we could have her on at some point as well. So the question was really like, how does the utilization of music and media fit into their pedagogical approach as educators or teachers, right?
So my background is in interdisciplinary study. I was a music and African American studies major in college, and then I was in the American Studies, African American Studies combined PhD at Yale. And that's where I had my kind of Stuart Hall, training was in graduate school. And so my practice has never been singularly defined by discipline, by methodology, by approach. And I think that's urgent and necessary in the study of Blackness. It just can't be any other way. But I also had training in movement organizing, which was as essential to the writing of my first book, Anthem, as anything else that I was learning in the classroom. So I try to bring all of those things together in ways that are both foundational for the students in the classroom, but are also destabilizing, right? That no, actually now we need to go look at some statistics. We need to be able to engage with FEMA records around what actually happened in Katrina. We need to be dealing with Clyde's work. So Clyde Woods's work as a cultural social geographer, right, is bringing all of those things together too, which is in part what made this place of UCSB so dynamic, was because Cedric, Clyde, other folks here were doing that work so rigorously and committedly and carrying it with them into all of the communities in which they worked. So I think the ways in which kind of engaged pedagogy or, service learning and things have developed through the artifices of the university are very surface and superficial. But if you're working through the work in the ways in which we were trained and we learned, which is both on the block and in the classroom, then those things become a lot more natural and dynamic for the students. And so it's important for me to be bringing all of these different methodological approaches, and in particular in the study of music, to really insist with them and to model it for them that the music speak for itself. So there are a lot of times where I'll just play a song and let it sit and see how they respond to me, right? And then I break it down. Well, this is what I heard. And I think that that's been really important in my writing too, because I know better than to think I can speak for it or do better than it, right? So what you do is you try to assist in building the interpretive world around it rather than speak for the piece itself. And I hope I'm successful in that. But the students coming to the work with a different way of listening has been really significant. And a lot of, I mean, even just mechanically, have you ever tried to have students drop a needle in your class?
No.
Students, right? Just the very technical elements sometimes have passed them over. So trying to do all of that stuff to make it tactile, to make it interactive, to make it grounded in the communities in which they live is really important.
Yeah, I'm still that.
Good.
I think I told you I come from a family where most of the Black women in the family were teachers, and so that was a strong foundation in terms of understanding how to teach and the various methods of trying to reach students who have different styles of learning, which is very important. And then you bridge that with, oftentimes we're studying places and people, and you can read like stats and data, which is important, but you don't get a full sense of how people are actually living and what their lives are like. And so, to add to that breadth, you need to have music, so maybe video, take kids to places, to see it, to what it looks like, what it smells like, how people are moving, maybe how people once moved. So you can take, for example, take them to Central Avenue in LA and say, this is, if you can imagine this place, 60 years ago, this is what happened, right? This is what it looks like now. How do we get from that to this, just so they can get a sense of it. And I think all those things are important, in particular for the breadth of Blackness, as Shana was talking about, like with work of Clyde Woods and Cedric. They're dealing with all of these things. And so you're just trying to bring that to life so that the students get just like a full sense of what is actually in these texts and what's going on.
I don't know what that last thing was that came on when the video was over. That's hilarious. All right. Thanks everybody for indulging me and allowing me to share these things today and hanging out. So yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say in closing. I can take a question or two. I do have to head out the door in about 10 minutes because I'm going to my other job. But yeah, I mean, the idea today was to share some things that I think are useful, obviously to educators, but really also to people within movements, right? That's really kind of within when I go to things like this, like a conference like this, really my eye is on, what are the tools that come from this space that we could learn from what people are doing and what they're talking about that could be useful in organizing spaces and movement spaces and struggles. And I think that's a lot of it. And I do think that a lot of times this is where and I'm not always sure that um like reading all of Cedric's work. I mean, I think people should read all of Cedric's work, but I think that the way that I think a lot of times seeing the way that his work influenced people, right? And seeing the people who were influenced by it as well as other things, you could really see how the attention that Cedric um, invites people to pay to the masses, to people, to culture, to ideas, to music, as well as like a very critical analysis of it all too. Um, that opens up worlds to engage with that when you're just doing political economy, sometimes you don't. And I don't think that's, as I said last time, I don't think you solely find that um, in the work of people like Cedric Robinson. I think that you find that also within people like Cabral, Du Bois, thinking about, all the different kinds of writing that Du Bois did over the years and the way that his work developed and changed. And, but I do think that, or CLR James, right? Um, but I do think that that tradition, like one of the things that I'm going to talk about in another live about it is also the way that people like Cedric and Elizabeth just, you know, like made space and like I mean, thinking about running those radio programs and cable access TV shows for all those years, right? And training people in how to do these things, teaching them internationalism, connecting them with movements around the world. Um, being a part that AMARC group, which came up a few times, which is basically like a global media access or public access kind of media network, right? That was focused on, supporting journalists from the grassroots in countries all around the world. I mean, that's really, really important work. Um, and honestly, like, the impact of that is huge in terms of making space for the younger generations of radical folks that like it's small work. It's not, I don't want to counterpose it and say like this is more important than, joining a party or doing revolutionary organizing or, like first of all, like Elizabeth is organizing a lot. Like Elizabeth was the mentor of the first SJP chapter, I think in California, but at UC Santa Barbara too, for sure. Um and so, like, these are people that have been deeply involved in organizing. Elizabeth, in as I learned this past week, even more than Cedric Robinson was. Um, so yeah, it's not a either or thing, but I think that you saw at that conference kind of the critical space that they opened up. Yeah, I look forward to talking more about that soon. Um, Upcoming stuff. So Monday, we will have another conversation with Abdul Jawad Omar. Definitely due for that. There's been a lot that has gone on. Even this morning, there's a horrific massacre that um, took place today, and so we'll talk about that massive one too. Like last I checked, it was like maybe 80 known Palestinians killed in this massacre. Um, And then, so we'll talk about the state of, the genocidal war and the liberation struggle in Palestine. Um, and then on Thursday, another another comrade, another intellectual I met out there. We're gonna have him on, and I have to pull up his bio and information. I don't want to state it. His name's Hamza, but I can't at the top of my head. I can't remember his last name. I apologize for that. So we'll get that together for Thursday. But we're going to talk about Malcolm X and Palestine, based off of a piece that he wrote about Malcolm X and Palestine. That's really interesting, right? Really interesting in terms of the changing dynamics too of a kind of history of a kind of connection between Black radical thinkers and Zionism, right? We've talked about this with regard to Du Bois. Folks have talked about it with regards to Martin Luther King Jr. and then Malcolm X, right? And why does Malcolm X become the shifting point, the breaking point, and the change for that? And an opening for a lot of then anti-Zionists, Black radical organizations and organizing. And so that's a really interesting thing. So we'll be talking about that. And I'm sure we'll have other things coming up too. I've been in conversation with HLT Kwan, who was also at the conference, who was just very warm and welcoming, as was everybody I encountered. But we'll talk about some of HLT's work on Cedric Robinson. HLT or edited that collection that's behind me that Pluto Press put out, which is a series of his pieces, like essays and articles and stuff like that. So anyways, we'll have some different things coming up soon. So appreciate you all tuning in this morning. Hope that you got something out of this conversation. If you did, yeah, like the video, share it with other folks. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. And you can support us on Patreon. That's something that always will help. Josh has been doing a lot of work lately on the audio side. Noah Tesfaye, shout out to Noah, was at the conference with me as well and has been doing some work with Josh on some of those audio episodes. So we do have a bunch more stuff coming soon and can always use the support. So anyways, great to be here with you all today. And I hope you all have a good rest of your weekend. And I'll talk to you on Monday.